ahead with part 3 of Egyptian Odyssey. Tonight, the mysteries of the pyramids and their role in Egypt's past. Reports are ahead, but first, part 3 of an Egyptian Odyssey. Tonight, the ancient mysteries of the pyramids.
The pyramids of Egypt, they're 5,000 years old and still as mysterious as ever. I'm Dr. Michael Guillen. Please join me tonight as I take a look at the wonders of ancient Egypt.
When the Ramesses exhibit comes to the Boston Museum of Science this spring, we'll have an opportunity to see some of Egypt's greatest treasures.
Egypt is a scientist's paradise, too, full of artifacts and mysteries like pyramids and mummies dating back to the beginning of Western civilization.
Now, in the final part of his Egyptian Odyssey, our science editor, Dr. Michael Guillen, reports there is more to these wonders than meets the eye.
By far the most impressive structures in Egypt are the pyramids. Most of them are 5,000 years old, and that makes them the oldest stone monuments in the world. The famous Great Pyramids are located just outside of Cairo on the west bank of the Nile. And beautiful as they are, it's nothing compared to what they looked like when they were brand new.
Most archaeologists believe that the pyramids of Giza were covered with a very nice layer, and that layer was colored, and that colored layer had the whole history written on the outside, and it has long gone with the weather and rain and wind and so on.
In some cases, pyramids are lined up perfectly with the North Star. That's because ancient priests used pyramids to keep track of the heavens and to predict yearly events like the flooding of the Nile every summer. Pyramids were also used to commune with the gods. Ancient Egyptians thought of pyramids as stairways to the sun and buried their pharaohs deep within the stone.
Inside each pyramid, there are passageways like this that lead to burial chambers, temples, and even storerooms full of treasures. For centuries, scientists have searched these passageways, but they've yet to find the pyramid's most secret chambers.
In some ways, the most mysterious thing about a pyramid is its shape. Farouk El-Baz has a theory.
If you go into the Egyptian desert, in the boondocks, where there is absolutely nothing, you find a conical hill. And you wonder whether the Egyptians had seen these things and built their monuments in their shapes because they wanted them to remain for eternity.
According to El-Baz, pyramids are aerodynamic, and that's why they can survive sandstorms for thousands of years.
I believe that if the structures that the ancient Egyptians had built were built in a shape of a square or a donut or anything else, they would have long gone.
From the very beginning, pyramids had a deep symbolic meaning to the Egyptians. The four corners of a pyramid represent the four elements of creation: earth, air, fire, and water. And the triangular face of a pyramid, that represents the sacred Trinity.
The sacred Trinity consisted of three gods who protected a pharaoh in the afterlife. The deceased pharaoh would spend an eternity with these gods, and not merely in spirit, but in body as well. This is the 3,000-year-old body of the pharaoh Ramesses II. For centuries, people have wondered how the ancient Egyptians managed to preserve a body this well and for this long. But now, thanks to modern chemical analysis, scientists...
Dukakis makes his plea for auto insurance reform and later an Egyptian Odyssey, and to look at the life and times of the Pharaoh Ramesses. Dr. Michael Guillen begins a series of reports a little later on News Center 5 at 6. Coming up, an Egyptian Odyssey.
Trip back in time to a world of powerful pharaohs and kings.
Inside this enormous museum in downtown Cairo, you'll find artifacts from the very beginnings of Western civilization. I'm Dr. Michael Guillen. Please join me tonight as I take a look at the wonders of ancient Egypt.
This This spring, an unprecedented collection of Egyptian treasures will come to the Boston Museum of Science.
It is called the Ramesses exhibit after one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs. And in anticipation, we sent our science editor, Dr. Michael Guillen, to Egypt to find out more about the man and his times.
Tonight, part one of an Egyptian Odyssey.
If you could go back in time 3,000 years, this would be the place to be in Egypt along the River Nile, and this would be the person to meet, Ramses II. He was arguably the most remarkable pharaoh of the most advanced civilization on Earth. A great deal had already happened in Egypt when Ramses appeared on the scene. The pyramids were 2,000 years old, and the country had been through 2 catastrophic declines. But when Ramses became pharaoh, Egypt entered its golden age and prospered as it never had before.
Ramses is quite known for raising the pharaohship to new heights.
Ramses ruled Egypt for most of the 12th century BC, and some say he was the pharaoh when Moses led the Jews out of Egypt.
Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, let my people go.
No one knows for sure, though, because there's no conclusive evidence that there were slaves during Ramses' time.
The record does not really include anything at all about the Exodus or of using slaves to build anything in Egypt.
Today, Egypt's ancient past is preserved in hundreds of magnificent monuments, and most of them were built by Ramses. During his 67-year reign, he was determined to leave a lasting impression on this land. And what was to stop him? Egypt was prosperous because of the fertile Nile Delta in the north, and it was wealthy beyond description because of its gold mines to the south. Above all, Ramses himself was incredibly powerful, partly because he was pharaoh, and partly because he was such a great self-promoter. The most famous example was the Battle of Kadesh, a battle Ramses claims he won, but didn't really.
Ramses came back and told everybody in Egypt that he had a marvelous win. He smothered the enemy and returned completely and totally victorious. And people somehow believed him.
Egypt's ancient past is preserved inside this enormous museum in downtown Cairo. There are thousands and thousands of artifacts here. Some of them date back to the very beginnings of Western civilization.
By far the most precious artifact here is the mummy of Ramses himself. It's not usually on public display, but by special government permission, we were allowed a brief visit with this once most powerful man on Earth. Ramses was in his 80s when he died, and in that time he fathered 50 sons and 40 daughters. He had many wives, but his all-time favorite was the beautiful Nefertari.
He loved Nefertari, and he is the only pharaoh that elevated his wife to his own level.
In his love for Nefertari, and of course himself, Ramses built this magnificent temple at Abu Simbel. Inside this sanctuary, statues of Ramses stand shoulder to shoulder with statues of Egypt's greatest gods. And all over the walls, stories tell of the pharaoh's godlike courage in his battles with the enemy. These monuments are overwhelming, but even in their presence, it's hard to imagine how any one person could have had so much power and influence. To the ancient Egyptians, Ramses was president, pope, and chief justice all wrapped up into one. And more than that, Ramses was a god during a time when Egypt itself was like a heaven on earth.
You know, I can't help but believe that Ramses would have loved all this. Here we are 3,000 years later, and we're still talking about him. Ramses, of course, will be the centerpiece of the upcoming exhibit. Literally, I mean, a 25-foot granite statue of him will stand at the entrance to the Museum of Science from April 30th to August 30th, which is how long the exhibit will be in Boston. By the way, tickets are going fast, so you should get yours now if you want to get there. They're by reservations only.
What a fascinating sure-free
Wow,
place, huh?
Oh, once in a lifetime.
How about tomorrow?
Tomorrow, we're going to ask the question, will Egypt's past survive into its future, and see how scientists are helping to preserve these monuments. It should be a terrific segment.
Okay, Mike, good. We'll look forward to it.
Coming up right after this.
Later, modern Egypt struggles with ancient Egypt. Efforts to preserve the past in part 2 of an Egyptian Odyssey still to come. All right, coming up, preserving the ancient mysteries of Egypt.
The conflict between the past and the present.
For thousands of years, the Nile River has meant life to the people of Egypt. I'm Dr. Michael Guillen. Please join me tonight as I take a look at the mysteries of this ancient land.
When the Ramesses exhibit arrives at Boston's Museum of Science this spring, it'll feature the largest collection of ancient Egyptian artifacts ever seen in this country.
That exhibit comes at a time when Egypt, the world's oldest civilization, is struggling to find a balance between its past, present, and future.
Tonight in part 2 of our series, An Egyptian Odyssey, science editor Dr. Michael Guillen looks at how science is helping to restore and preserve Egypt's ancient treasures.
In Egypt, time runs slowly. Peasants today begin each day in much the same way their ancestors did when farming first began here. Anywhere else, 3,000 years would be a long, long time. But in this land of eternal sunshine, 3,000 years ago seems like only yesterday.
It's amazing, but here in the village of Gamula in the Upper Nile, you'll find people who are the direct and pure descendants of ancient Egyptians. They've never intermarried with the Arabs or anyone else, and in many ways, life here hasn't changed much since the time of Ramesses.
These are the Coptic Christians. They've long since renounced the pagan gods of their ancestors, but in their physical appearance and daily behavior, they are a living and breathing reminder of early Western civilization. In church, the priests conduct services partly in Arabic and partly in Coptic. What you're hearing is the direct descendant of the ancient Egyptian tongue, and quite possibly the oldest language on earth. When it comes to cooking, villagers here still make bread the old-fashioned way. First, they bake it in the sun so as to conserve energy, and only at the very end do they burn precious fuel to brown the bread in their ancient-style ovens.
3,000 years ago, Egypt had the world's best artisans. Today, though, those artistic skills are in danger of being forgotten. The government is so concerned, in fact, they've started an exciting new project which brings together Egypt's past with its future.
In this school on the outskirts of Cairo, boys are being trained in skills that date back thousands of years. And at this school, young girls are learning how to weave, much as villagers might have when Ramesses was pharaoh.
And we learn them how to read and write, but especially we give them a profession to live in the future in it. You see, all these kids can't afford the normal fees of the education.
National treasures like this are also in danger of being lost forever. There is a problem. If Egypt is to have a future, it cannot afford its past. It is a third world country with too many people and too little money. Since Egypt's past belongs to us all, people from all over the world are pitching in to help restore and preserve its ancient monuments. These Polish scientists are piecing together the magnificent temple of Queen Hatshepsut, one of the few women pharaohs ever to rule over Egypt.
I'm very glad that I can help Egyptian people, and we are very glad to help Egyptian people to reconstruct this temple.
Further up the Nile, the most dramatic international rescue effort to date was played out here at the temple of Abu Simbel, Ramses' greatest temple.
What happened was when the Aswan Dam was built on the Nile, the waters here at Abu Simbel began backing up. The temple was in danger of being flooded and lost forever. Scientists figured out that in order to save it, they had to move it. But how do you begin moving a 265,000-ton monument?
The answer can be seen in this rare historical footage. What scientists did was to cut Abu Simbel into 100 different pieces. Each piece was then moved to higher ground, well away from the Nile. Today, Abu Simbel stands triumphantly as a monument of hope, and Egypt, with the help of others, is once again a country striding into the future without trampling its past.
The Aswan Dam is definitely a mixed blessing for the Egyptians. On the one hand, the electricity from the dam is Egypt's ticket to the 21st century. And yet, on the other hand, there are places where the higher water levels are corroding famous monuments. Just a few weeks ago, for example, a chunk from the shoulder of the Sphinx fell off. Evidently, water seeped into the stone and weakened it so much that just a strong gust of wind broke the piece free. Chet?
It's incredible moving that temple. It's hard to believe.
Isn't that wild? I mean, hundreds of pieces, and they moved them a long distance to higher ground.
What's on tap for tomorrow night, Mike?
My favorite piece, it's on pyramids and mummies and what scientists are doing to try to understand these ancient mysteries. That's my favorite piece.
All right, we'll look forward to it.
I love when you said they bake bread in the sun.
Pretty
when
hot.
We consider we turn our ovens to 375 here. Shows you how hot it can be. All right, coming up, another...